Okay, thank you everyone for giving me the chance to talk this morning. So I'm going to talk about the rise and fall of sustainable transport policy in the UK. We don't have a national transport policy at the moment. Paradoxically, rather than this leading to a period of paralysis in decision making, we've actually got the most ambitious infrastructure investment plans that we've had for 25 years, and we're actually implementing those infrastructure investment plans. Our decision support tools have remained more or less the same over that 25-year period, and the policy context is one which recognises ever greater environmental constraints. So more environmentally concerned, not less. Yet we don't have an integrated plan, and we're building lots of infrastructure which will stimulate mobility. So really this is a reflection more about the politics, the institutions and the policy processes that we go through in transportation to try and figure out how best decision support tools can support decision making in ways that actually assist with that. Just the structure of the talk, I'm going to start by trying to introduce the relevance of this to the body of work in Yannick's thesis as a bit of a context setter for later on, and ask some questions about boundaries of planning. I'll talk about the rise and then the fall of transport policy, the political context around that, but also the practical processes that we went through, maybe something similar to some of the things which Otto mentioned around the Congestion Commission, but the practice of integrated planning and the challenges of actually delivering that, and then think about the implications. So Yannick's thesis is entitled Indicators and Beyond, Assessing the Sustainability of Transport Projects, and I find the title in itself intriguing as a challenge to the way in which policy happens. You can look at policy from a very top-down perspective, rational planning, setting of objectives and so on, or as one of our interviewees on one of the projects I worked on said, from a bottom-up approach, policy is actually what you spend your money on. It's not what's in your strategy documents. And a lot of the money that we spend in transport is on infrastructure projects. They're very expensive. That dominates a lot of the decision-making process. So Yannick has an aspiration in the work to ensure that project impacts in terms of sustainability are identified and become inputs to decision making. And that's really important because we do tend to think and deliver in projects. But obviously the project lens is really challenging when we've got aspirations for sustainable development, because sustainable development really probably you take a whole planet approach to thinking about sustainable development rather than an individual project approach. So ecosystem health, climate and resources, quite difficult to look at from a single project point of view. And obviously we've got mechanisms for global cooperation, but we don't have global government. So we end up breaking down this notion of sustainable development into a national and then subnational set of issues to think about. And then below that we've got the project level analysis. So I think from a spatial point of view, kind of the project to the whole planet perspective is a challenge. And then the second set of boundary issues, are we thinking about all our activities, or are we just thinking about transport? So we may be thinking about transport projects because that's the sector that we're working on. But again, really we should be looking at a whole systems approach, but we don't do that because it's probably too complex to do that. There are historical precedents why we don't do that. We've not planned in that way, and all of our institutions are there which tell us not to plan and work in that way. So although occasionally we try and bring these things together, we find that very difficult. So we do have this notion of sustainable transport, and in some ways that's defensible. We know Benfield and Replogle, 2002, there can be no sustainable development without sustainable transportation, because transport is so important to emissions, social impacts, health, resource use, and so on. So we live with this working in the transport sector, but we know it's suboptimal. Things like should we go for electromobility? Well, it only makes sense if we have a much more integrated whole systems approach to our energy provision and the transition to smart grids and everything that goes with that. But so even if we can accept that working in sustainable transportation is not everything we'd like it to be in terms of achieving sustainable development, there are still some more important boundary issues to think about. So should we look at projects, or should we look at programs of projects and packages? Should we be looking at the sustainability of the ring road around Copenhagen, or should we be looking at the sustainability of the whole set of transport investments for the Copenhagen region? So should we be accepting of bad outcomes in some projects, which are offset by good outcomes in other projects? Should that happen within an institution? Is that the Belgian Railways? Do they have to be entirely sustainable, or is it Belgian Railways and bus and car taken together? So those important boundary issues exist. And they're important when it comes back to thinking about what organisations get, why they're managed the way they're managed. So private companies are responsible to their shareholders. Public organisations are responsible to their organisational remits. And as I'll show in the example that I go through in the UK, that really does matter when it comes to being accountable for the decisions which you're taking. What's in everyone's best interest is not necessarily in your best interest. So the project level has a kind of different outcome, perhaps, to looking at things in a more strategic and integrated way. So I think, though, the challenge of the project is really important, because projects are so important to the way we go about doing things. So I'm going to go into a case study now, but I thought I'd start with a simplified diagram of transport institutions in, well, I say it's the UK, it's not actually the UK, this is England and Scotland, and I could have a different diagram for Wales and Northern Ireland, our four principal administrative units, and this is from 5 years ago. So we have a national government here, and then we have an English Department for Transport, and then Scottish Government has its own organisation. We have a roads agency here. We have a rail agency, which is across both, although managed in different ways. We did have a regional tier of government in England. That's gone now. They do have weak regional agencies in Scotland. And then we have our cities and our rural areas and our small cities are all managed in slightly different ways in different organisations. Since this was drawn 5 or 6 years ago, we now have a new National Infrastructure Planning Commission. We've started a process of devolution of transport powers to our cities in England. We've given more powers to Scotland for managing transport. So this is all somewhat on the move. And I haven't included in here the network of relationships that exist, because we have a highly privatised and liberalised public transport system in the UK. So there's lots of organisational remits to be dealt with. Maybe this is similar in nature to the kind of cross Belgian issue which Kathy was raising. So I'm going to try and explain how this all worked with planning for integrated sustainable transport policy, and I'll try and also give some positive messages rather than leaving us with a kind of doomed, it's all too complicated perspective at the end. So I'm going to try and tell the story of the rise and fall of integrated sustainable transport planning in the UK through this timeline, and I'll jump off in 1 or 2 different places to try and make sure you don't drift off. But what I've done here at the bottom is to give you an idea of the political colours that underpin this. So at the start of the process, we had a right-wing Conservative government, then which goes all the way back here in terms of its duration, but this is the kind of start of our story. Then we have a left-wing Labour administration here, which lasted for 13 years. And then at this point here, we had a coalition government, majority right-wing, but also a centrist Liberal Party. And then we've recently gone to an entirely right-wing government again. And the politics does matter to some degree in this. So I've gone back to 1989, where we had a government white paper called Roads for Prosperity. And this was really the end of the kind of road building hegemony, those kind of big power structures of the road builders. It was, in 1989 prices, a £17 billion road programme, which was intended to get rid of congestion on the UK major road network. And it was only very, very partially implemented. The plan fell apart, partly because it was unaffordable, partly because there were some very significant environmentally based road protests, which caused a major political rethink. Partly in the early to mid-1990s, there were two pieces of work going on. There was a national commission which suggested that building new roads would generate additional traffic. So that caused a rethink to the underlying principles of the programme. And Phil Goodwin and colleagues there work on New Realism, which said, well, even if we did build the biggest road programme that we ever could do, we couldn't fit that in our cities, and we can't build it fast enough to cater with the growth in traffic anyway. So what we have to do is think about managing demand. So by the end of the period of Conservative government, we didn't have a big roads programme. We had some schemes that we were going to build, but nor did we have a transport strategy. So the Labour government took over in 1997, and in 1998 published an integrated transport white paper, and in 1999 published its first sustainable development strategy. So we had aspirations to integrate policy across sustainable development and transportation. It looked and it felt joined up in that sense. Within the approach that was adopted here, we went for a more multi-criteria analysis approach to our appraisal. So we did include things like landscape and townscape and so on. And work by my colleagues Peter Mackey and John Nelthorpe showed that that made a difference to the sorts of schemes that were being prioritised in the planning process. However, by 2000, the government was being criticised for being good on strategy but not actually doing much. So it developed what was called the 10-year plan, which was a major investment programme, £180 billion over 10 years. It included goals for building things like 25 urban light railway lines, for 20 congestion charge or workplace parking levies, some major rail and road investment as well. We commissioned what were called multimodal studies, which I'm going to talk about, between 2000 and 2003. These were integrated strategies designed to deliver more sustainable packages of transport policy measures. So this is a chart of those studies in the UK. They varied quite significantly, as you'll see. They're kind of the green areas of where the studies were. So this one here was really essentially a study of a road problem accessing a port. This one here was studying the whole of the West Midlands urban area. This was a large corridor study, which is not entirely, but primarily related to access to the southwest, which is largely a rural and tourist destination. So they were quite different in nature. They were run by consulting companies working with all of the different stakeholders, and the packages that they came up with looked in aggregate something like this. So 59% of the spend was on public transport schemes, 10.5 billion or 37% on highways, and a small amount on other schemes, and an additional 1.1 billion per year estimated in revenue support for these different schemes. So really, it's at this point that things fell apart. Not that we couldn't develop the studies, that we couldn't decide what would deliver the more sustainable outcomes. But a number of things happened. So these were all in addition to the existing schemes that were planned by the various different delivery agencies. So the amount of money that was required here was seen to be unaffordable. So Secretary of State saying that would be more than we get for 20 years, never mind for 10 years. So the totality of the planning request, unusually, was always more projects out there than we can afford to do. It was too great. So then how do we decide which were the ones that we were going to take forward from that? And probably just as important, though, the studies were done as packages. They were integrated packages across all modes. And the preferred options made sense in terms of the value for money of the package. And within that would have been some projects which performed relatively poorly if you looked at them in isolation, and some which performed particularly well in terms of the overall benefits. However, whilst, for example, a rail improvement might make sense in a package in terms of avoiding the need for a new road to be built, it may not make sense in terms of being one of the best rail investments that could be made for the rail network. So it makes sense from a package point of view, but it doesn't make sense for the rail operator. That's not in their top 30 schemes that they need to invest in order to improve the rail network. And if you're the director of the agency that's accountable for spending public money in the best possible way, do you want to be seen to be investing in the scheme that's number 60 on the list rather than in the one that's number 30 on the list? So it's not necessarily in your organisational interest to be investing in things which benefit the other agencies. So when it actually came down to deciding what was going to get spent out of this, the road agency was waiting for the outcome of these studies to deliver what it wanted to deliver. The rail agency had another set of priorities and did not get involved in delivering that. And the local authorities didn't have the schemes that were designed in here ready to go on the books. So what we ended up doing was implementing more of the highways programme, and some of these schemes are happening, but they're following on a long way behind, and lots of the other schemes aren't happening. And we've certainly lost the notion of any form of sustainable integrated package for the area. So what happened next during the years of the Labour government can best be described as drift. So we had a new sustainable development strategy, and we had several new people in charge of our Department for Transport, each of which produced a paper. So this was towards a sustainable transport system. This was delivering a sustainable transport system. But actually what we were doing was writing strategy documents, not actually doing anything substantially different. I would say our highlight in government terms was the adoption of the Climate Change Act in 2008, which set commitments for our long-term carbon reduction to 2050 and interim periods. We decided not to set sectoral targets within that, but it has begun to have an impact on planning for transportation, largely in terms of electro-mobility. But probably the biggest kind of impact was a change in government. So all of this policy development and thinking here was shelved at the point that the government changed. So they abandoned all of the strategies that were there before. We had an economic downturn, obviously, as everywhere in 2008-09. So in 2010, the new government came in and it said it was going to cut expenditure everywhere in government. And transport was no exception. So there were plans to cut £300 million from spending in 2010. However, by 2011, all of that money had been reinstated in capital spend, and there were plans for even greater amounts of capital expenditure in transport. And the reasons, I think, behind this were that the Treasury felt that capital spend on infrastructure was good for the economy. It was good for the construction industry. It was likely to stimulate economic recovery. The Department for Transport, because we've had this, I guess maybe because we've been doing lots of studies for the last 6 or 7 years here, it had a list of schemes which it had benefit cost ratios for, and that appealed to the Treasury. It was trying to work out where best it should spend its money. So at least our sector has some data on what the likely return of investment is going to be. And there was a political narrative that we were falling behind other nations as a developed nation because we weren't spending as much on high-speed rail as China or whatever, the kind of logics that come out there. But essentially what we've done is very quickly switch from integrated sustainability thinking to a logic which is based on infrastructure will generate growth. So in general, in politics, there's a very strong symbolism between a healthy economy has lots of mobility, therefore if we build more infrastructure, that will encourage more mobility, therefore it must be good for the economy. The building's not exclusively roads. There's a £20 billion Crossrail scheme in London. There's £50 billion for high-speed rail. I'm not saying that there's a bias necessarily in one sector or another, but what I am saying is that the logic of the investment has completely shifted. The government objectives for what it's trying to achieve are quite distinct. So we don't have a UK sustainable development strategy anymore. That was also one of the things which was archived. So we have no sustainable development strategy. We have no UK transport strategy. So kind of what hope for sustainable planning at a project level? So on one level, I could mount an argument it doesn't necessarily really matter on the basis of the evidence presented here, that at least that's not a deterrent for things actually progressing. What's more problematic, I think, is the set of objectives around which it's being organised, which are the kind of pro-growth agenda. And I'm just not sure why the logics which unpick that from the 1980s to the middle of the 1990s have gone away, that we will still have to manage the congestion impacts of a lot of the additional mobility that these schemes are going to generate. We're not facing up to managing any of those. The fact that we have a National Infrastructure Commission, to me now, suggests that we are thinking in terms of projects rather than people and systems. So we're not actually planning for the mobility needs of society, we're planning for infrastructure growth. And they're not completely unrelated, but we don't have an engagement with things like demand management, for example. And I don't think, therefore, we can have a meaningful social engagement on what demand management means and why we're trying to do that. So I think one of the things that we need to do is, as part of this, when you think about why it fell apart, it partly fell apart because of the change in the circumstances, but it also partly fell apart because the institutions that underpin the delivery of sustainable strategies, in any case, weren't capable of dealing with this set of outcomes when it was first produced. So I think we need to look at the organisational structures and the remits and the accountability, what we hold these departments accountable for, rather than looking at narrow value for money around what they spend. We should be looking at whole government or whole sustainability impacts, so that they have a responsibility within their own individual organisational remit to be paying attention and explaining how they're dealing with these cross-institutional issues. I think if you hardwired that kind of thing into their institutional remit, we would also have much more difficulty with politicians moving the goalposts quite so quickly and easily in the way that was done within the UK. As a positive note, I mean, more integrated arrangements do exist, and if we look at just within the UK context, I think London does have more integrated powers of planning across different modes. It has responsibility for the economy, land use, and sustainable development, and I think it does plan and operate in a more integrated way. It's not perfect, it's not always internally consistent, and I'm pretty sure if we looked at each of the individual projects that Transport for London does, we wouldn't be able to identify them all as sustainable. But as a package, I think it probably is. So I think that more integrated institutional arrangements do exist and they do have potential, but they're obviously difficult to deliver. In the UK, again, we're looking at devolution to cities, which will give them more integrated powers. And I think, again, that offers us an opportunity to make things happen in a more, I guess, in a way which is more closely connected to local societal preferences. But I also think we should accept, if we're doing that, that there will be a chance of failure, because some areas will want more roads. They will want investments which we may not see in a kind of green meritocracy as consistent with sustainable transportation. I would say over time, citizens will demand more and more of that. But I think in the short run, we should accept that there will be different places which will have very different priorities. And should we learn to live with that? I very much hope to see in that kind of space more experimentation with the sorts of tools which Kathy was bringing forward. I think our national obsession with one standardised set of assessment rules in the UK paralyses our decision-making. Everything gets referred back to this one standard set of criteria, and we end up fiddling what gets included in our criteria in order to make the sorts of schemes that we want to see happen. That's not the right way of doing it. We should be deciding what sorts of schemes fulfill a more sustainable future, and then we should be looking at how best to deliver those, in my view. So I think different set of decision support tools could be really important there. Now, I was just going to go on a slight diversion as we come to the end here. In terms of this experimentation and devolution and giving people more of a say in decision making, so I'm going to share a bit of Brexit pain with you here. So we had our referendum on leaving the European Union, and this is a couple of charts I wanted to show you with the voting constituencies. The yellow are the majority for Remain, and the blue are a majority for Leave. So there are lots of complicated reasons why people might vote to Remain or Leave, and so not every blue shares the same set of reasons. There'll be a different set of immigration pressures, for example, on the southeast of England, housing prices and so on. But what this says to me is we should anticipate much greater diversity of preferences in our decision making than we currently allow for in our planning processes. And if we look at the breakdown by different socioeconomic characteristics, I think there's some really revealing things in here. So your area is much more likely to have voted to Remain if you have more residents with a greater level of education versus no formal qualifications. But importantly, median age of residence. So there's been a lot of analysis done, much more likely to have voted to leave the European Union with a greater degree of older people in the area than younger people. And in terms of planning for the needs of future generations and this idea that there's a future generation stakeholder out there somewhere, actually, we're really not even respecting the majority views of the generation that we understand on the planet here today in the way we've gone about this decision-making process. So I think the diversity within the population, as well as spatially, is going to be a really important part of understanding what kinds of engagement we need to have. And so just to conclude, I think we need to have a greater focus on how we organise, coordinate and regulate our institutions for sustainable development. I would like to see us free up our decision-making processes to do more citizen engagement, but we're clearly going to have to be very careful about what we allow, or communicate where the limits of sustainable development might be in shaping some of these discussions. I believe that there's far too much of an impression that the green meritocracy scientific understanding of sustainable development is actually out there and well understood and accepted. And I think we'll end up with a very challenging implementation scenario. But I think actually that's probably where we should be headed. So, thank you.
Thank you. Do we have time for one or two questions?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah, a couple of questions. Great. You made it so well that you don't dare ask a question.
Well, you've been sat here for an hour and a half.
But then I have one. It sounded like that this is the highways have a high profile in decisions. What about the low social groups and people with low education living outside the urban areas? Are they behind this highway lobby that we have in Denmark also?
No, I would say that if we were to do a full analysis of the distributional benefits of the infrastructure investment plans, it would definitely go to the higher income. I mean, if you the high-speed rail examples, a good one, £50 billion, and really low-income groups will only benefit in terms of the capacity that's freed up around the existing city networks when some of the other trains are taken off it.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's very good engagement.
What if you had some equity social profile in your sustainability indicators? What?
Well, I think
really score on?
It is assessed. It's just it's not important relative to the overall economic growth narrative. I mean, I think that's how government...
But if you were making another study and you were giving a high priority to equity and low-income groups, what would that change?
I would say the biggest thing it would change would be the value that we give to capital versus revenue funding. So the sorts of things that make most difference would be supporting bus services, improving local environment and so on. And those are the sorts of things that government's still taking money away from in favour of capital expenditure on bigger infrastructure programmes. So we treat money in two completely different ways in the UK. I don't know if that works in the same way in other countries, but we treat what we spend on new infrastructure quite differently to the day-to-day.
Yeah.
Just one question, maybe to both of you, that this you talk about experts and then stakeholders, but sometimes, I mean, the experts are sort of also stakeholders if they come from like the road director. And how do you consider that? I mean, who is like the neutral expert actually in this? I mean, of course, it could be the university researcher, but I mean, in like this real decision making.
I think that, I mean, that's probably, I'll defer to Kathy in the sense that I think we can provide different sets of evidence, but I think you encourage a variety of stakeholder groups to be engaged, and don't think for each project or program maybe that's different.
Yeah, I think we will have that discussion also with experts and stakeholders. But for me, yes, an expert should be someone objectively, type of way of looking at things. It can be a transport model, it can be measuring emissions, that you really try to have it objectively. Otherwise, indeed, you get a bias. But there is an interesting study this afternoon that will be discussed, because indeed there might be some confusion about, is it an expert or is it a stakeholder?
Yeah, so let's close it.
Yeah, I think that was an appetizer to the afternoon session. So I hope to see all of you and many more participants in this. It has been a very interesting warming up session, I think.